Hi, my name is Jesse Starks. I'm one of the co-founders of selfinvestigation.org. Selfinvestigation.org is a nonprofit project devoted to answering the question, who am I? And the thing about this question is there's no way to answer it in any single definitive, absolute way. What you can do instead is shine light on it from multiple angles. These angles include cognitive science, philosophy, history, evolution, psychology, meditation, psychedelic research, consciousness research, poetry, art, and more. What we try to do as a project is find the intersection of all these domains and distill it down so that people can aim this question at their own lives. So that's number one. Number two is a single podcast episode between Dr. Taylor Guthrie and Nate Hagans. In this episode, they talk about values, attention, identity, the default mode network of the brain, meditation, and psychedelics. And because this podcast episode has so much overlap with our project, we wanted to host a live Zoom discussion to take it apart together. And that's what you're about to see. But before you watch this video, we encourage everyone to please consider listening to that conversation with Taylor and Nate and take it apart yourself, and then return to this video and hear everybody taking it apart together. We very much want this to be a two-way thing, not a video you watch and walk away from, but something you actually actively take apart with us and contribute to in the Reddit thread. On that note, we hope this is one of many discussions like this. We also read books together and take them apart in articles and essays. So if you are interested in any of these topics, head to selfinvestigation.org, and there's a community link with an email registration and also a link to our discussion forum. So with that said, I hope you enjoy this discussion. And again, please share your thoughts. Thank you.
Nice.
There's Jake.
Good
Hi, all. Good morning.
Good morning.
morning.
All right, so I guess I'll frame this and then kick us off. So
Awesome.
um, you know what? I guess I'll weave my own introduction personally into what we're talking about here. So, I've probably known Lance for maybe 2 years and Josh for probably almost as long. Truman met you recently during our stranger reading club, and Jake reached out just recently to jump on this one. So, right out of the gate, we're all sort of interested in hovering around the same topics, which is what motivated me. I was kind of just talking with Josh. I just looked it up this morning. It was in June last year. We decided to start selfinvestigation.org to frame so many of the things we're talking about regularly, which is, just to run through very quickly, the core thing here is who am I? So getting into identity and realizing that so many domains have something to say about that. And then, this is sort of looking across those domains and trying to find the intersection. What struck me the more I explore this question is that there's no single right definitive answer. It's just that there's lights shed on this from so many angles. And then this particular podcast. So first of all, thank you, Lance, for pointing out Nate Hagen's, because I think, that's an interesting podcast he's exploring, which is just, sometimes it's called the polycrisis when you look at the cluster of crises or problems, systemic problems happening across the globe, trying to take that apart. So he spends a lot of time on ecology um, and dissecting those problems. But in doing that, he runs into a lot of the same territory we explore. So
Mhm.
his conversation with Taylor Guthrie, just really sent off all kinds of blinking lights. It just lit up, very quickly when I hear the default mode network. I've been, you know, monitoring the default mode network for, I want to say like 5 years or so. It, Michael Pollan in his book, How to Change Your Mind, kind of popularized that. The default mode network, I think it was Marcus Rakel. I can't remember precisely when I think it was early 2000s where he, famously found, what is the brain doing when we're doing absolutely nothing? Most fMRI studies were trying to get people to do certain things and then looking for brain regions that lit up using fMRI. Marcus Rakel was one of the first to say, well, let's find out what regions light up when we're doing nothing. And then he found this default mode network. And then since then, Michael Pollan came out and How to Change Your Mind was mostly about psychedelics. And maybe scientists, the scientific community didn't exactly love how Michael Pollan described the default mode network because it almost made it sound like the ego and the ego is a bad thing and like you should get rid of your ego. I don't fault Michael Pollan for that. I think he did the best he could, speaking to this community, talking about psychedelic experiences. I think we can mostly credit Michael Pollan in that book for opening people's eyes. But since then, I think the scientific community has tried to be more precise about how they talk about the default mode network and also specific regions in the default mode network. What comes to mind is the prefrontal cortex, which Taylor talks about. So very quickly, before I spoil too much of this, when I heard Taylor talk about identity and the prefrontal cortex as a hub of the default network and values and attention, etc., I found that, and also meditation and psychedelics that's hitting so many boxes. So I just found this really fascinating. I've listened to it 3 times now, just trying to comb through and make sure I understand his viewpoint, so that because I kind of walk away excited from this, but then I just wanted to make sure I'm really not just getting ahead of myself and I really understand the content. And then finally, it's helpful to talk about this with others who are interested because I think that helps us all sort of firm up our understanding of what we heard. So that's my little introduction, and so maybe we'll just go around. I'll just use the screen order that I'm seeing here. So Lance, quick intro and anything else you want to add. And then what we'll do, after a quick intro from everybody, we'll just go through and point out our highlights. So I have a list here. I know Josh does, and maybe
Yeah.
Truman and Jake have the same. So, and we'll just kind of play off what each other are pointing out as we go.
Nice, nice. Um, well, hey guys, and Truman and Jake, nice to meet you. I've talked with Josh and Jesse before, so this is really great to get to meet some new faces. So I guess my background is the self-investigation for me began quite a ways back. I was raised devout Christian and ran through the course of that. Spent more than 30 years there, but was ended up doing, I was hoping a refinement project on my faith, deconstruction, reconstruction. At the end, it became kind of a house of cards that fell apart. And when that did, I was outside of religion and I couldn't put the house of cards back together. So naturally, the question was, well, if that was my worldview, my center point, then what is reality? What am I? Who am I? And so that began my inquiry process. And so that went on for several years. It's its own tale. In fact, I think it's on the website. But that journey actually ended up resolving. And since then, it just became, well, now that that's cleared up, what really matters is how I live my life. And slowly, it was values I realized were in fact the handles, the levers, everything hinges on values. And so I love Hagen's podcast. I've done a deep dive on it. I've only known it for 6 months, stumbled across it by looking at an interview he did with Ian McGilchrist. So if we're interested in neuroscience, hopefully we're all familiar with Ian McGilchrist. And it was the breadth of Hagen's questioning and insight that blew me away. The ecology side, the economics, business, finance side. I've never heard someone who could come at something from all these angles at the same time. So that's what led me down the great simplification rabbit hole. And yeah, it was actually Jesse who pointed out you should listen to this podcast because the title was, I think, how do you become who you are or something like
Who
that.
you
And
want to be.
who do you want to be? And I'm like, well, yeah, you just know what you want to be and do it. Like this sounds completely uninteresting. And then it's like, listen. And I did. And I just, wow, like you said, it checked all the boxes. So anyway, I'm trying to put together my own life post or built upon values and investigation winds up in this case being a homesteading project in New England, and it's a lot of fun, a lot of work. So yeah, my real question I want to put to the group then, and I know you said we'll each do a quick take. I just planting flags that um, what Tyler raised, both he and Hagen's painted a picture that for normal people, they approach values and identities in fashions X, Y, and Z. And that really wasn't the case for me. So I want to hear from other people. Are their descriptions of normal seem to ring true with you, or Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out, am I an outlier? So, but we'll take whatever angles. It was a great conversation.
All right, let's go to thank you, Lance. Let's go to Josh, Truman, and then Jake.
Hey everybody, my name's Josh. I met with Jesse, Lance, and Truman now, different occasions, but known Jesse the longest. I would say I got interested in like the self-investigation stuff. I feel like I was like, I don't know, I grew up like in a military background, my dad, and so we moved around a lot growing up, and that kind of just, I don't know, helped me kind of, it made me see a lot of parts of my identity and stuff that were tied to like the particular areas that I was living in, like cultural conditioning and stuff like that. And so I would say that's kind of where the question started, sort of for me. I was always kind of like, oh, what's like the part of me that's, that's staying the same in all of this, or what's the part that's going to be constant, I guess. Um, and then that kind of, I don't know, those questions were there, but I kind of just put them to the side and went through the motions of, school and work and stuff like that for quite a bit. And then about 2 years ago when like I first reached out to Jesse, I was like going through like kind of a big family thing, dealing with like some just like a terminal diagnosis in a family, and it was just like
Mm.
very like kind of life shattering of like, dang, like I kind of want to figure out these questions now. They felt the most important, and yeah, and so I found Jesse originally through like the Anti-Rebel blog, and really liked what he was writing about with like, yeah, just kind of linking these a bunch of these different worlds together, and ideas all centered around this idea of like the self and who am I, and how science, art, philosophy, all these things kind of start help us kind of trying to answer these questions. And yeah, it's been a really cool process since. I feel like I've made some progress. And I feel like this podcast especially has was like a great culmination and just kind of like distillation of a lot of the kind of at least, yeah, just like good, it kind of just outlined all the major talking points that I feel like we can kind of like just laying some foundation, I guess, for conversation, which so I'm really excited for today. Yeah.
Cool.
Great. Hi, I'm Truman. I am probably a little more recent in this whole journey. I spent a lot of my adult life as, I would say, a deep skeptic, an atheist.
Mm.
I was very much a physicalist, and
Mm.
there's some things there that I'm still trying to explore. So I became very interested in neuroscience recently, but I'll say that January of last year is kind of when I had what I would describe as the dark night of the soul. I had a very hard time. I was grappling with a recurrence of depression, and I was experiencing some very dark and deep things inside of my own head, and I knew I didn't want to stay in that space. So I had to look at what I could do to change things for myself. And I kind of went to a number of different sources. I wasn't looking to faith specifically, but there are certain aspects of spirituality that now really deeply appeal to me. And so I learned about meditation, which was something I'd been deeply skeptical of for most of my life. And when I finally gave it a try and I was given the wisdom, it's hard because that's the point. It's supposed to be. Things really started to click. I started to sort of see my own thinking. I started to become aware of the way my brain works. And that was very enlightening. And so I didn't want to stop learning about myself and learning about the way human beings work. And I think one of my great struggles now, really short story, is that my depression was so bad that I wasn't able to get a degree in college, and it's a deep regret of mine. So I'm trying to figure out how to sort of make up for all of this lost time. Like I want to write, I want to contribute, I want to show people, I want to show fellow millennials who have the right amount of privilege to like really look at these scenarios, look at these situations, and do some good in the world, share
Nice.
compassion with people. Like I want to show people that that's possible, that you can go from, being in the dark place that I was and go into a place where you really want to make a positive difference. And self-investigation popped up at really just the right time. So, Jesse and Josh, I want to thank you again for its existence.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, Jake Garrett, born and raised in Utah, grew up Mormon, had my own personal disillusion and while I was studying in Egypt and had a tailor bear his testimony to me and it just the cognitive dissonance and unraveling kind of happened for me after that. But I lived as a very staunch agnostic. Felt very strongly about that up until about I don't know, a year and a half ago, December of 23, and something happened. I don't know what still, but just had this burning desire and passion for um, all topics around self-investigation, about figuring out who I was and why I was the way I was and what that meant and purpose. And a lot of my interest I would say the majority of my interest is more in the mystical side of things.
Nice.
So generally, I things will start out mystical, and topics like this, Guthrie, I've even looked at some of his other stuff after that podcast, but it's helpful for me to kind of marry the physical to maybe, whatever you want to call it, the spiritual, metaphysical, whatever, but marry those two together and kind of make sense of it a little bit in rationalize it, because I still struggle with maybe rationalizing some of the experiences that I'm having, right? Whether they're meditative or psychedelic or some sort of Jungian synchronicity. All of these things are very hard to explain, but when I can dive into some of these discussions from, in this case, from a neuroscience perspective, which I struggle with, someone way more eloquent can, like Guthrie, can explain it to me. It very much resonates. This podcast was very interesting to me because I've always struggled with motivation my whole life. And although when I have the motivation, I'm a steam train, I'm just unstoppable. And so for me, I was very interested in this because I was like, okay, how else, maybe I can add another arrow to the quiver for figuring out how motivation works. So very much resonated with me. The examples that they used, especially with pairing low motivated people with high motivated people, right? Very much I can speak to that myself as being inspiring. Oftentimes, I'll qualify myself as a low motivated person in many cases, not all, but in many cases. And also the conversations around will and free will, I thought always had resonated with me. And we can get into those, but I wanted to kind of, Lance, touch on some of your question on what resonated and what didn't. Those are the two things that really stood out for me.
All right, that's awesome. Great introductions. Maybe what we'll do is just go through the same order. I'll skip myself this time, maybe cut to Lance. And Lance, you already planted a couple flags.
Mm-hmm.
So just build on that and whatever else, maybe just do a quick inventory dump of what popped out to you in this conversation.
So I guess since everything seems to keep coming back to values for me, and this can tie into motivation and identity. I think at some point in the conversation, Guthrie really just simplified it in the most amazing way I've ever heard, that values simply are what is important to me. And so there's like this crisscross of identity and values. And I think that statement sums the crisscross up. What is important to me? And is there a me separate from what's important? Is there anything important without it being important to someone? I think there's a real crisscross there. And so then if that's true, and to me, it seems to be, and I'd love to hear anyone who agrees or disagrees, then the values are also like the pivot points or the fulcrums from which we make life decisions. And so if what's important to me is, let's say, ecosystem health and balance. Okay, so there's a reason I'm not living in a city and playing video games all night like I did at one point. I'm trying to grow food on the dirt and tend to trees because, that's important to me. And so anyway, why I'm trying to plant the value flag is Hagen's at some point asked the question, do you think there's a lot of people today that lack values, like they don't intrinsically have a strong value system, and therefore they're getting, I guess, inoculated maybe, or I hate to say indoctrinated, but anyway, media and society can fill your life with values for you. And if you don't have them already, but if you do have them already, there's either natural acceptance or friction based on those intrinsic values. And they also talked about how intrinsic and extrinsic motivation can have intrinsic or extrinsic values. Are they coming from the outside and going in, or are they on the inside coming out? And anyway, so they posited a lot of people in our society are lacking intrinsic values and intrinsic motivation. And that's what I struggled with is, I mean, maybe I was that way myself for many years, but later it just, I don't know, like tending a garden, they just showed up and grew organically. And so now it's like everything is intrinsic for me. So that's the thing is, am I weird? Or do you guys find that to be the case? Yeah, I guess, how's that for a,
I can jump in and just agree right away that values seems like the biggest um, fulcrum in that whole conversation. It's the linchpin, I guess, of connecting all the topics. Like, I think the word value first came out of Taylor's mouth when Nate said, "What is identity?" And he more or less equates identity to values. And I think,
yeah,
I don't think this is substantive for this conversation. You can pick at that a little bit and break identity down further, and maybe make points that, okay, there are parts of identity that aren't necessarily value based, but if you're just, looking at big picture, I do think value for me uh, counts as a lot of identity. And the second thing you were talking about, Lance, is, this is all speculation because really, how can you look out in the world and say most people are extrinsically motivated versus intrinsically motivated, or their
right.
values are extrinsic or intrinsic? But it would seem to me that, we're kind of put into the world under some environment of constraints, depending upon our upbringing. And then it's almost like a rite of passage to move beyond those, recognize and move beyond those constraints. And that
Yeah.
part is not guaranteed in life. I think you can be, if it seems totally plausible from, again, I think we're all just trying to share our perspectives and see what each other think. But from my perspective, it seems totally plausible to sort of land in a world where your values are imposed from the outside, and that's sort of what you live with until something maybe knocks you out of that, or causes you to pull a thread and dig a little deeper. So I'll pause there and let everybody else react to Lance's.
I was, the a couple things that really stood out to me were the examples of being out in nature, and I can't remember the exact example, but it was someone on the phone, right? Rather than
Mhm.
enjoying nature, they were getting their fix or their dopamine or whatever it was on their phone, or the gambler example as well.
Mhm.
And um, you know knowing what your value is, or believing, hey, this is a value that I have. For me personally, that really hit home, because I've always known, I gotta finish studying, or I've got to get this project done, or whatever it happens to be. That's the value that I know that I want to have. But I end up, scrolling on Reddit, or whatever it happens to be. And through over the last year or so, I've been a lot better at pausing and taking a moment to say, why is that? Why do I know what I need to do, but I'm not doing it? I'm rather doing this other thing. And that's been really helpful for me, and maybe it's getting older. I'm not entirely sure, or having more intrinsic value. I still don't know, but I'm getting better at that personally, and getting a lot of value out of it.
Mhm.
One thing that I'll bring up here, and not to deviate too much, but that I've noticed myself is, as I do this process, right? And I guess you could just sum it up as self investigation, but as I do this process, it's definitely been harder as I start tackling, I'll call them values that are more core to my identity, or things that I've assumed I've just needed, right? There's some things that are very easy to identify for myself as, that's a want, that's a want, that's a want. I want to scroll on Reddit. I'd rather watch this TV show. But when I had someone the other day, I was telling someone, I desperately crave connection with friends, with other people, like-minded people, in my relationships, romantically, whatever it happens to be. That connection, for whatever, is, for me, the last year and a half just skyrocketed. And someone said, well, why do you think that is? And do you actually need that? And it kind of like offended me a little bit, but I realized I had ingrained it so deep in my identity that I didn't even consider questioning that. So as I bump up against these values that are more core, I find it almost sometimes my reaction is, oh, I don't want to think about that. Which is exactly the moment that I should dive deeper. So a bit of a tangent, but this is kind of the domino that, listening to the podcast kind of reminded me that, some of these are easier to tackle than others for me personally.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you guys are like all the points you guys addressed. I guess kind of going back to the first thing you brought up, Lance, of like you know, I guess the idea that it seems like a lot of people like the question of like what I guess the question of like what really are intrinsic values and like whether a lot of people today are lacking them. And I feel like at least in my own life, I don't know, something that came up to me or that kind of made sense listening to the podcast too was like the relationship with like attention. Because I feel like I've definitely gone through state like I feel like the biggest limiting factor for me in like I don't know I'd like to think that like I don't know I like to think that intrinsic values and motivation are always there and I think are there I'd like to say for most people too I think in my opinion I feel like the biggest hindrance to accessing them is just like the ability to notice them and I feel like um
Okay.
whether you're getting inundated with work or like or then they bring up like the idea of addiction and like short-term reward and stuff like that that can also distract you from it and so I think it's hard because I think like twofold it can be hard to like distill out which like you were saying, Jake, like what of your values are truly like intrinsic to you. Because to be able to like feel them, I think you have to be paying close enough attention and like have the time and not have other things pulling it like your, cognitive abilities to like really feel it. And that was also something I was going to bring up later, but I guess like I feel like just like how this process isn't, entirely like thinking based, like the idea of it being like kind of very cerebral and reflective of just like, can you just think about, because I feel like I've gone through stages in my life where it's like if I just think about what's important to me like over and over again, I feel like there's that old saying, like if you ask like why enough times, like you won't be able to get an answer, sort of thing. So at the end of the day, I don't think it's like a fully like just thinking reflective process either. I think I don't know, maybe like it can be like practices like meditation where you're getting more attuned to not only like what your thoughts are about what is valuable to you, but also like how the physical reaction in your body almost or something like that. Um, but yeah, I think that was my thing. Like I feel like I do feel like everybody kind of has intrinsic values and motivation at the end of the day, but I think it can be I think like just being so distracted and so like spread thin, I feel like it can feel like you don't, and also kind of like you can kind of be forced into maybe distracting the like getting away from those towards ones that are just kind of fed to you by society, I guess, sort of.
Mhm. Didn't want to cut anybody off, so um, yeah, the attention thing is interesting.
Mhm.
Attention was a huge part of that conversation too. What I liked is the distinction between directed and reflexive attention. Just recently we talked a lot about attention. I think you know, at one point Higgins asks Taylor, what can you do? Just say you're this hypothetical person who's, these are real oversimplifications, but for purposes of conversation, they're helpful. So you have a person who's a quote unquote unauthentic, trying to become authentic. What can you do? What lever can you pull? And Taylor's going after attention. And I think there's a couple aspects to that. One is directed attention, and just to play off a point Josh just made, you can't, this is not a pure thinking process. Like if you're trying to jump from hypothetical point A to point B, you're not going to like think your muscle your way through it with thought alone. Like there's dissolving agents, I'll call them. He cited meditation and psychedelics, but there's some aspect of loosening that rigid model or the thermostat he sometimes called it, or the default mode network. Like what I like about these is like you can talk about it as this symbolic model, say it's a thermostat, but he's actually linking that to actual, brain
Mhm.
mechanics and structure, which I really loved. But so I want to recognize and just reaffirm that point you just made, Josh. It feels like there's a constant back and forth between relaxing your model and then reforming it in a way that does feel authentic to you. And I think, when I think it's fair to say everybody might feel as if they have intrinsic values, but I also want to play on something Jake pointed out where sometimes those values that feel core to your identity might turn out to be, like something that was imposed from outside. And it's just a matter of looking at it carefully long enough to say, yeah, actually, that might not be as much me as I once thought it was. So there is that curveball kind of sitting in there for people to discover. Um, so yeah, I would just before I jump in other directions, I just want to throw that in there, the aspect of attention and reflexive attention, because that the reflexive attention, that's the other half of this is, you know, one thing Truman mentioned, you mentioned in your intro was that was kind of revolutionary for you was seeing your own thinking and becoming aware of how your brain works. Like I completely, totally agree. Just a very short story from my end. When I started experimenting with meditation, I was just kind of doing the, okay, follow the breath kind of thing. And yes, it's relaxing. And yes, all problems seem to go away. But I sort of started to experiment on top of that. Like no one directed me to do this, but as I was meditating, maybe 4 or 5 times a week, usually end of the day, I would just keep a little journal and, yes, thoughts would come and I would let them go. But as I would let them go, I'd just write a little journal entry about what it was. And I started doing that over days and weeks and months. And then I would see, on a notepad, even from one meditation session, it's like, wow, I thought about that like 10 times. And like it's not even that important to me, but for some reason I'm reflexively thinking about that thing. So it's like that was a huge aha moment for me. It's just like, man, the brain is going to reflexively notice what it thinks is important, which is a weird thing that's described that way because now I'm talking about my brain as if it has agency outside of me.
Hmm.
And that's a rabbit hole we can't resolve really, or I can't easily, so I won't go there, but that's how it feels. So I can just leave it there. It's like noticing that your brain has a mind of its own and will reflexively point things out that aren't necessarily important to you. And that started this long road of me just, you know, um, it was Adi Ashanti, who's this, teacher who writes about just taking himself apart. He has this phase in his life where he just journaled, journaled, journaled. He kept aiming the question why at himself and, wants. I think Jake, you brought that up. Is like, why do I want this? Why do I want that? And he kept doing that until he hit bedrock. Like and I it, his experience describing that sounded very similar to what I did myself. It's just once I became aware of reflexive attention and these values that might not be mine after all, I just started digging, digging, digging. And, I don't know if there's really such a thing as bedrock, but it really felt close to it. It's like, okay, I've really, rifled through a lot of this stuff. And it's a process that continues now. It's just paying attention to what my mind is reflexively, it's using directed attention to kind of pay attention to reflexive attention. And it's like a
Ah.
little feedback loop, right?
Hmm.
Lance, you have something to jump in on there?
Cool. I'll come back to that. I mean, I don't
Yeah,
want
go for it.
to.
That's kind of the end of my little brain dump there.
Okay. Well, y'all had to go. I don't. Truman, did you want to throw something in before I'm happy to take the attention ball and go run with it. But if you
There
want to,
was something I wanted to say about values actually before we
cool.
completely leave that topic.
Yeah, yeah,
And it was
please.
something that you said, Lance. You said, and this is interesting to me. You said something about indoctrination, and you backed
Yeah.
away from the word very quickly. And I thought that that reflex was very interesting because when I look around at humanity, I see all of us being essentially domesticated by other humans. Like we have been taught values extrinsically. We have been told how to behave, and
Mhm.
we adopt those patterns and we make them part of us until something helps us distinguish, what should change that pattern. So uh, I wouldn't be so hesitant to say the word indoctrination because it
Right.
often is like that. People, our parents want us to adopt their values, and
Right.
religious institutions want us to adopt those values too. I was thinking very much in the video about how it was posited that almost all of our values are kind of taken on in adolescence, and they don't dramatically change so much after that. And that's an interesting contrast to my experience because I feel like I have learned a lot of new values, in adult life, in very recent adult life, and I think it takes some really deep self-investigation to do that. Like we're very comfortable with the patterns we have. And I think one of the things that I really love about talks like these is that they are giving us opportunities to say, yes, you can look at you can look at your programming. You can try and think differently. You can observe how other people behave and try and figure out where these patterns come from. And I just don't think there's enough opportunities for that. One thing I think about often, this will be short, but I have a 10-year-old. They just started middle school. And they have like a 45-minute part of the day that is for critical thinking, creative and critical thinking. And just trying to separate creative and critical thinking was already kind of a mystery for me. I have to talk to the teachers about this. But I just love the idea that this program is allowing that space for, there to actually be some time where in school children can think about thinking. I hope that's what's happening. And I'm going to have an open house with the teachers soon to talk about that. But I think, giving people the opportunity to look at why they think the way they do, showing them that they can do that, I think that's very valuable. Anyway, that's what I got.
Cool. Right on. That gives me another dot to connect the dots with. Shall I take a stab at it?
Go for it.
Okay, so yes, in a word, then Truman, neuroplasticity, right? And I really like the way Sam Harris frames that. Is not only can you change your brain, you can't help but change your brain. You can't not change your brain. Changing your brain is, in fact, what brains do. But good point about the adolescence. I think Guthrie said something like there's twice as many synaptic connections in a child's brain entering adolescence, and it actually is pruning, eliminating connections as it develops over the next several years. So yeah, it's pretty fascinating to think about. And yeah, I had a lot of values that haven't changed since I was young. Um, but some of them have, and some of them maybe they have changed in an expression. They're not fundamentally different, but maybe they have different foci. Anyway, so you can change your brain, and this is important to acknowledge so that people don't have to despair if they have mentally difficult areas in their life. Like that, you can work with that. So let's connect that to attention. Listening to this conversation, I had a bit of an insight into, I hate to say it, the mechanics of tinkering with your brain. Jesse, we had a conversation on the Reddit somewhat recently that talked about, and I'm going to blank on the name, but I had used the term meta attention, and we had a different word for it in the Reddit topic.
Meta awareness.
Meta awareness. That's
Yep.
it. So the same thing. And so ever since I've been talking about meditation and introspection with people, once things really clicked for me, let's put it that way. One of the quickest summaries I would like to throw out there is just pay attention to what you're paying attention to. Like that's 99% of the work. Pay attention to what you're paying attention to. Well, how do you do that? And so that topic of meta awareness, I'd listened to some podcasts about this and intention researchers and figured out even in the literature, there's no name for this. So one of the closest that kind of gets near it is an executive function in the frontal cortex, but executive function can cover a lot of things. And I like narrowing the scope of the discussion to attention itself. And so I use the term meta attention, and I define that as the ability to observe and direct what you're attending to. So attention itself is its own capacity. In a vision analogy, I'll use awareness or consciousness as the totality of the visual field and attention as the foveal or central vision. So they're integrated, but attention is part of the field, but it's movable. So if someone were to slam a door in your house right now, your attention would go to that, even though we're having a conversation. That reflexive attention, it just goes. However, we do have the ability to keep track of where that attention is and to move it. So I've often argued with people about mindfulness meditation that you can't train the capacity of attention itself, but you can train meta attention. You can train this ability to direct it. And when he brought up that point of reflexive attention, which I never had a word for, but I love it, if you have a sufficiently developed sense of meta attention, the reflexive attention is within the purview of attention, if that makes any sense. So when you get pulled, it's like I think Sam Harris uses the term a mindfulness alarm or a mindfulness flag. It's like, whoa, my attention just got pulled. And the question is that, like you said, Jesse, the brain thinks there is something important worth attending to. That's why your attention moved. What does the brain think is important? And it could be a loud noise, a sudden movement, a notification sound on your phone, whatever it is. If that meta attention is online in sufficient degree, it doesn't matter that the reflexive attention kicked in. That can, just the fact that it kicked in can highlight an introspection, like, why did my attention get pulled? Where did it go? And am I happy? Do I want it to keep going that way? Maybe I don't want my phone notification to distract me. So I walk over and I just mute the phone and then go back to what I was doing. So the reflexive attention is still at work, but there's that executive function on top of it that keeps track of it and can respond to it. And the more you exercise that executive function, that meta attention, those neural pathways, this is just my armchair hypothesis, you know, they're going to wire up more with, well, more strongly and increase that capacity for attention. And that is neuroplasticity. So we can use the ability of distraction to sharpen our ability to not be distracted or to minimize the duration of distraction. Okay, sorry, that was kind of long, but
I just want to, I, this to me feels like the undersold missing part. You know, if there's a value proposition to meditation, it's what you just described, in
yeah,
my opinion.
yeah.
And it's more radical than it seems because it's related to values and identity.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, and I see us all kind of nodding. And, you know, to me, it's just like, you know, we can all look out at the world and see how people are behaving and you know, try to compare our own bench against ourselves and our own strength of meta awareness or meta attention and what we've learned ourselves. And it's just like you see meditation floating out there as a tool. But I would say by and large, and this is kind of, you know, I think prominent enough for me to just state it as a matter of fact. It's like most people don't care about meditation. And, you know, I don't want to sound preachy like, oh, people ought to care about meditation and, you know, this, but it's like I shake my head because if you're able to make all those, like, because Lance, I think you put that about as simply as anyone could, but to someone who's never heard any of this before, it still sounds like, what the hell are you talking about? Like meta attention and executive function. It's just like, just imagine the everyday. No, to be clear, I 100% appreciate that and agree with how you framed it. And then I pull in an imaginary person who's hearing that spiel, and it's just kind of impossible to understand, you know? Lance, are you still with us? I see Lance is frozen. So he might
Yeah, I saw a screen switch, so I think he's paused or frozen.
okay. Yeah, so
Um,
yeah, so anyway, the end of my little thing is like that. It feels like that's the part that's too bad is there is this radical side that's sort of hard to see. That's all.
I wish Lance was here. I really
He'll
liked
be
what,
back.
yeah, I really liked and appreciated what he said. I think he kind of was able to verbalize a lot of things in my own head, but also connect, a few of the dots that have been hanging out there for me. Um, I would love to bring just for a moment in Joe Dispenza. I know he's kind of big box self-help, but when I was going through my journey, I really appreciated him because he was able to marry together for me some of the more experiential parts of who am I, what do I want to be, with some of the science. And that was such a gradual introduction for me, right? Jesse, to your point, someone off the street who isn't on these Zoom calls, it's a little hard to swallow, some of these topics, especially if you're sitting down with Lance and just listen to what he had to say. I get excited, but not, for a lot of people, it's hard. But Joe Dispenza for me in that time was perfect. And they, I think I can't remember if it was Guthrie or not, but they talked about, when you've identified something that you really want to change, what helps is actually assuming the identity rather than identifying the individual components that you yourself need to change. So, for example, if I want to start exercising, if I focus on, running 1 or 2 miles a day, that's great. And I may do that for 6 months and feel great about myself, or I may lose that 15 pounds that I'm looking to do. But then when I'm done, who knows what will happen. But assuming the identity of a runner, Jake's now, I'm convincing myself now I am a runner. I'm a daily runner. I'm the type of person who runs marathons. And if I start thinking that way, then I assume more of the individual components that actually make up those the long-term components that are sustainable, really, which is what I want in the end. I want health, right? And distilling what I really want down to something oftentimes for me comes down to something that's more sustainable. No, I just want to be healthy. I don't necessarily want to lose 15 pounds. I want to actually be very healthy. I don't want to go too long with this, but Joe Dispenza was a great introduction for me into how do I change these behaviors. But one of the things that was lacking, and Lance tied this together for me, why I've had a hard time with, well, that I've been able to change some things in my own life that I really struggled with. But there's always been something that's lacked there for me, like it feels like cheating, a shortcut. And even though I've changed the behavior, Lance, you really tied these things together for me right now, and I appreciate it. If I never talk to you guys again, I'll remember this conversation. Because
hopefully many more to come.
Yeah, but for me, the distillation and following the breadcrumb or the neural pathway, however you want to look at it, but that meta awareness of, well, why is this behavior that I want to change? Why do I have it? Why is it part of my identity today? You're able to understand that process versus just change it. And I think that for me feels like the true identity adoption that a long time ago that Joe Dispenza really resonated with me on. If you can understand that neural pathway back, I think that's the longer change or that you can bring into yourself. That meta awareness process, I think, for me, seems more sustainable in long term. Okay. That's the end there, but I wanted to get that out there. And Lance, I think he's gone again, but
Yeah, I think Lance was present to catch most of that. So while we're waiting for him to jump back in and respond, I just want to you mentioned being healthy as like kind of a North Star. This is not totally like center of the bullseye for that conversation, but it was pointed out anecdotally a couple times, and I just find that so Josh, you mentioned addiction and distraction because we're talking about values and we're talking about attention, and attention is this scarce resource there's an attention economy out there always trying to seize on our attention, and it's easily and in addition to the out there attention economy, we have our body that's also trying to allocate attention. He brought up that food example, right? If you're hungry and you pass by a restaurant with this great fragrant food, it's just like, I want that food. But if you're not hungry, like you just don't care about it. So what that makes me think about is, by looking at health as this thing to have in good order, you're freeing up more of your attention most of the time. I just want to call that out as something that feels so right. It's like, not that anybody needs to be a health freak or like go overboard with this, but just some baseline of good health seems to give you some more attention for yourself. And now Lance, are you there? Maybe he's fighting some internet battles. One other thing too with psychedelics is like, because Taylor didn't spend a lot of time out there, he just threw out, and I liked how he did this. I appreciated it because it's a whole rabbit hole, and I understand like you have to unpack that carefully. But I personally see, this, I talk with Josh about this sometimes. There's this so-called psychedelic renaissance trying to happen, and sometimes it feels like a little exceptionalist or overblown. But I do see substance there. Right away, who comes to mind is Roland Griffiths from Johns Hopkins, who did that famous, psilocybin TED Talk about terminal patients, clinically depressed people just kind of fixing themselves overnight somehow with one psilocybin session. And it's like, okay, maybe unlike Tim Leary, we don't put it in the drinking water and expect the world to fix itself. But there's something here. And, I just want to call that out too, is like, meditation and psychedelics, and I think other ways to relax this so-called default mode network. Like, there's definitely a key ingredient there. So that's all I want to say on that part too.
And I
Yeah.
feel like you can marry these two together, right? You know, I feel like my meditations have been way more powerful with when I have when I bring in the tools I now have, the more tools that I have for self, breaking apart, distilling, and that general self investigation. So absolutely,
Yeah, yeah, just to riff on that for 1 second longer, like what it feels like what meditation or psychedelics need are a framework.
yeah.
And this is where I can appreciate what Buddhism did for centuries. Like, okay, maybe you can critique parts of it today, and but if nothing else, Buddhism provides a context in which you can sort of dissolve this model and rebuild yourself. And this more modern setting, even at Hopkins, they're in that room and there's some Buddhist like ceremonies going on in that room. So that seems like the big question on the scientific and clinical frontier today is like, what is the right context? And finally, I'll just kind of nod with you that um, to the extent we're trying to build a little context, it does seem helpful. So anyway, to summarize that, if you're going to meditate, you're going to do psychedelics, and you're going to do other things to relax the self model, it's also really helpful to have these other tools to, structure yourself and do that rebuilding process, the scaffolding, so to speak.
Yeah, something. Well, the scaffolding piece was something that really stood out for me as well. And I feel like that's where, um, I don't know. I guess something that stood out to me, and I guess I wanted to open it to you guys for discussion, is like he basically kind of like I feel like his argument is that if you can do this yourself, undertake the whole journey of deconstructing and then like reconstructing with reflection, meditation, psychedelics, all these different kind of methods that are um means of figuring out what's like intrinsically valuable to you, what's like what motivates you, those sort of things. Like I feel like that is like the ideal, but at the same time I feel like he recognizes also that like that it takes a lot of time, and like we've all been showing, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of like resources to a certain extent. And I don't know, something that I thought was really interesting was like he brings up the idea that scaffolding can also take the form of, becoming part of a group that can motivate you to, I guess, value certain things, or, change certain parts of your identity, and like, I guess, readjust that model of self when it maybe is not serving you anymore. And I think that was interesting to me because I feel like at the same time, then he also talks about like the dangers of being strictly motivated by like extrinsic motivation. And so it's kind of like, I think it's hard because it's like, you know, I guess it is like it's a reality that maybe a lot of people aren't going to have like the time or resources to undertake this journey like solely individually, like, whether it's through psychedelic meditation or like long periods of reflection. And so I feel like that's why a lot of people gravitate towards like whatever it is, like, culture, like cultural belief systems, organized religion, these sorts of things that kind of tell you what to value, and then like how you should, organize your sense of self and stuff like that. And so in like it seems like he like at least in this like, he was saying how like showing both sides, that it can be extremely like dangerous, and it can lead you in this place where you're solely like kind of pushed by the tide of culture or religion, but at the same time that's kind of it can also be it is also, I guess, a method for, and so it's kind of a method, like I think he says at some point like choose your groups wisely basically, or something like that. And I thought that was interesting, and I just kind of wanted to open up to you because I feel like that's something that I think like we've all kind of, I think, when I first kind of came upon like the self-investigation, road, I was very almost like I think Truman, you said, like I've definitely identified with the idea of being very skeptical because I like didn't want to, I wanted just what's true for me, sort of thing, and not kind of fall back into those traps of, groupthink, or, being pushed by culture, religion. And but at the same time, it's like I do. I don't know. I come kind of back the other direction of like I think I see what role and what value these can bring to people, and how they can resolve a lot of suffering. And so yeah, that was something I just wanted to open up to you guys and see if you had any thoughts, I guess, about it.
Yeah, I can just I also picked up on both signals from Guthrie in that conversation. One, he was sort of cautioning against groupthink and how that, specifically groupthink that will not tolerate any diversity of opinion and, kind of will shun people for thinking outside. I think that roughly represents so much cultural ditches you can fall into nowadays and where people do reside, so to speak. And then he distinguished a certain type of group behavior, which is more first as you pointed out, he recognizes the value in community. This is and just to reaffirm another thing you said that he said a few times, it's like this is not easy and it's not convenient, but it is worthwhile. It's all of those things. So if you can connect all those dots, then great. And if you can do it in a community, then that's also really great. And the community is powerful. And such a community should um, emphasize individual insights and should tolerate differences in perspective and opinion and not fall into those groupthink traps that he was describing earlier. So I'm kind of just, I'm agreeing with both you and it's a slippery slope, obviously, because how those are general guidelines, but how do you know you're not falling into groupthink trap or dogma? So, I've always tried to inoculate against that with, just emphasizing, your own experience and your own tuition and your own reasoning, always falling back on that, but then at the same time trying to reconcile with other people. Those two things working in conjunction seem really powerful to me. So that's a little bit on that.
Yeah, I know to resist groupthink myself. Basically, anybody who tells me that I shouldn't be curious about something, I have to put my hand up to them. Like, I think curiosity is one of the greatest virtues, and I think a constant pursuit of the truth is kind of our role on this planet. We need to keep pursuing the truth. If the truth can kill something, it should die. And I think groupthink really just happily gets in the way of that sometimes.
Yeah, and when you say truth, it's like, man, what a interesting experience to try and even sort out what truth is nowadays. And like, it depends on where you're hanging out and who you're talking to, but just like you don't have to go far to find that truth can be really controversial. And it's just like it's at that point you can't even really find your footing to have civil conversation. At that point it's just like, it requires at least some integrity and some good faith discussion to like, okay, fine, we can agree on you know points A, B, and C, and we will now have a conversation on top of those points. It's just like even that is hard. This is just a little side comment nowadays in my own navigation of the world. It's just like I just find that really interesting. And this is a tangent. I could talk about it separately for a while, but just as a consequence of information Armageddon, as Lance has said a couple times, it's just like finding truth and consensus values and facts is a tricky thing nowadays.
Yeah. Can I throw something in there?
Yeah, and also Lance, feel free to do any catch up from what you were absorbing but never had a chance to respond
Yeah.
to.
Apologies. I have either an ISP issue or my router was freaking out. I don't know what happened. So I missed a fair bit of several minutes ago. But just that I picking up on the idea of groupthink and how do we have a community that is inoculated, if you will, against the pitfalls of groupthink. Going to throw back to, shall we go to values? This was quite a few months ago, I think, on the Reddit for self-investigation. I was conversing with another guy on Substack, and he proposed a trifecta of values for inquiry, investigation, truth-seeking, etc. And the trifecta was curiosity, that's one of them, skepticism is another, and humility. And he said, if you remove any one of those three, you're going to go off the rails. You need curiosity, skepticism, and humility. And if you have those as an individual, you'll have the clarity and courage to resist groupthink. But you won't be doctrinaire or dogmatic because you can't be doctrinaire and dogmatic and humble at the same time. So if you can find then a group community that shares the same trifecta of values, then the group itself will operate much more. It'll put up guardrails against those types of things. So anyway, I thought that was just a brilliant trifecta because if you remove any one of those three, things go bad. And there's something magical about that combination of humility, curiosity, and skepticism.
Yep. Yeah, I recall you sharing that, and
He did a
just
Venn
be
diagram of it.
yes, and it you know clicks just as strongly now as it did back then, and also just affirms, Truman just brought happened to bring up curiosity. I just happened to
Mhm.
be talking about skepticism, and now that kind of just weaves it all together.
Yeah.
Humility is a big one. I'm going to butcher this quote, but it's just like there's I think it the this I'll find this after. There's a book by Stephen Batchelor about the art of solitude, something like that, and he's quoting a fellow named Montaigne, I believe, and he says, "There's a plague on man, the opinion that he knows something." That's the quote, and I love that. It's just like, okay, no matter how freaking well you think you have something nailed down, just check yourself a little bit. There's no reason not to do that. And then what's comical is, okay, take that stance and now look at the circus and society. It's just like that quality is so absent most of the time.
Mm.
So anyway, but the trifecta is great. And Josh, I don't know how satisfying that is to you, because you kind of brought to the table the reservations, but also, you're kind of teetering between both. I think we all are. So how does that trifecta?
No,
Uh,
that's perfect. I think something that like was, that it's been very like true in my own kind of journey with this stuff, and like really ranked through this podcast was just kind of like um it's yeah, I guess because it's just a tough balance to find, I guess, because it's like when you're like I feel like for a lot of people, the like and for me too, it's like that the step of the first step of like self-investigation was like a very it felt very like skeptical, I guess, if that makes sense. Like I was kind of turning inwards, like just kind of unrooting everything that it's like, oh, why do I care about that? Or, like, why do I really value that? And it's just like it can lead really quickly to this place of like I don't, nothing really matters. Like, only thing that really, that I can say like I really value is just like short-term reward, like a dopamine hit, that sort of thing. And like that's another kind of thing I guess we could move to next, maybe is like the idea of addiction and stuff like that. But anyways, and so I think what was missing there is like the humility to recognize the limits of your own, reasoning capacities to come to like an absolute truth about the world. It's like you can reason your play, like I guess that's kind of like not a nihilistic stance of like, oh, nothing matters. And then but the humility is gonna fight that back and say like, is that totally true? And I think that is what's missing to me. But then on the humility side, it's like you also don't just want to be led kind of by blind faith in what other people are kind of telling you what to do. And so then you need to activate that skepticism.
Mhm.
Um, and I think something you said, Truman, at the very beginning with like even like the meditation stuff, I think then you could even tie it back to the balance between like thinking and feeling, because like I think I was also like very skeptical of even like meditation and stuff like that in the very beginning, because it's like it also is like kind of it's a humility in a way of like, even to recognize thoughts as just thoughts and not as absolute truths about the way the world is. And then um in the idea that there's like an intelligence and what your body is telling you, the physical signals you're getting, like it can feel a little like woo woo, and like your skeptical alarms can kind of shoot up. And but yeah, I think that trifecta is perfect. That's definitely described my experience, and I think finding a balance between those is the key.
but not too perfect. We'll still be skeptical of that
Right.
trifecta a little bit.
Yeah.
I do like the trifecta, the scaffolding metaphor. I loved. I when they were using that, I thought, man, isn't it nice when a building's done? It's beautiful. It's a beacon for everyone, and when the scaffolding's up, though, I'm always looking at it and wondering what it's going to look like when it's done. And then it really made me think like, but that's the most beautiful time for me personally, is that growth, that investigation. And when it's kind of, having a finish line can sometimes be boring. Yeah, or it's just like, well, what's next? Okay, let's put more scaffolding up. But the humility part for me, I'm just like, oh, I think that's part of the scaffolding, the willingness to just be like, I don't need to be a shining beacon. I don't need to have it put together. I'm still working on myself, and that's okay. And now I'm kind of looking at this differently, and I'm like, okay, is there beauty behind just having permanent scaffolding up, or is there a time and a place to be a shining beacon, or to be complete? So, I'm using air quotes, but yeah, thanks. I'm tying all that together, and I think the metaphor rather is a beautiful one.
I'm doing a quick scan of my notes now to see if there's any major points that I didn't get to express today, but I think we actually wound up hitting just about everything I'd want to talk about. There's also plenty of tangents we brought up that I could dive down, and we'll table those for another day, hopefully. I mean, that's what's nice about this particular conversation, again, is that it hits so many topics and weaves them all together. Um, so while I'm doing that, please do the same. And does anybody have any big, big things or topics, themes that we didn't touch on yet?
I
Yeah, I did a.
do.
Oh, I
Okay.
do.
No,
Sorry.
go right ahead. But I've got one too. And so I'll just throw out, maybe we need to do a part two if anyone has to run. I love this,
Yeah,
but
and also,
I'm good to go.
on that point, I think this is a great format, and there's plenty of content and material to absorb. So between the longer form reading clubs and the more topical things, certainly would love to continue these sessions.
Yeah, the topic that I would love to dig into, perhaps in a future meet, would be about mental time travel, which came up in the talk quite a bit.
Ah.
I have a lot of my attention has come onto the idea of chronesthesia of mental time travel and how important it is to our cognition. I have barely begun to skim the surface of the topic, so I would love to dig into more of that and actually get around to talking about it with you guys.
Yeah,
I second that as well. Yeah.
Juicy,
and
juicy.
just this is total coincidence, but Lance has already read My Stroke of Insight by Jill Bolte Taylor. I'm in the middle of it, and right now she's in mid-stroke at this point.
Oh,
She's describing that her left hemisphere, what again, this is an insane situation because we have a neuroanatomist who's totally aware of what happens during a stroke, and she's able to take this apart subjectively while it's happening. Simultaneously, she's feeling euphoria, but also terrified and understands she has to get herself to a hospital. It's crazy.
It
But
gives me
what's
chills.
Yes, so it's a
it's
fascinating read. I hope others will join that
yeah.
session. But to the point you just made was mental time travel, and her
Mhm,
mental time travel is basically shutting down, which is
mhm,
why she's in this very weird place because in order to pick up the phone and understand she has to get to the hospital because there are consequences in the future, she needs that temporal time machine, but she doesn't have it, and so she just loves everything that's happening at the same time. It's
Mhm.
so bizarre. So I can't wait to keep traveling this book. But yes, mental time travel seems like such a, we don't, I mean, speaking for myself, it's not something I think about a lot. It just kind of always happens. And yeah, it's like getting me through life and it's there. But just to think how freaking important that is, how fragile it is, how imperfect it is, how
mhm.
much of a nuisance it can be sometimes, like there's so much there. So yes,
Yeah.
totally agree. That's a
And
fertile
Jesse,
ground.
one of the things about that triggered for me about mental time travel was, you know, I feel like everyone talks about the now, being in the now, which I find a lot of benefit in, but I also wonder too, how can I better use the mental time travel? How can that benefit me, versus being in the now? That contrast seems like they're very dualistic, they're polarizing, at least on the surface. And that triggered me like, okay, how can I not be in the now and how can I
Right.
best use mental time travel?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've always thought, sometimes some of those cliches are just overemphasized and they feel like the ultimate, but it's just like, well, okay, fine. Like now, wonderful, but like we still have a mental time machine and we're still living a life and like that's still relevant, right? Like, so you kind of have to find your way back there. So I'm just agreeing, like, yes, you know,
Ooh, ooh, I have a way
both are
to,
important.
yeah, tie a ribbon around that. Um, so the mental time travel, you do it now, right? Like you can't do the mental time travel in the past or in the future. You do it now.
Right.
So my question for the group, and like if we want to schedule another one, that'd be awesome. But like I said, if you want to really dig into any of this, that's great too. It was a discussion of both the values and that idea of meta awareness. Um, and Guthrie asked at one point, how much in the run of any given day do people consciously reflect on their values and say, am I doing right now that which is truly important to me? We mentioned scrolling on the phone when there's probably better things to do. And so this is that meta attention or meta awareness that's sitting on top of this process. And anyway, his question in the podcast was, how often do people reflect on their values, i.e., what is important to me? And he, I think, postulated that doesn't happen very much. And this was my question to other people. I'm like, really? Because it's how I spend my entire day every single day. And it goes along with that meta attention or awareness.
I can represent the opposite data point, I guess, is
Huh?
that I feel I have the meta awareness muscle kicking in where, I can catch myself thinking about something and quickly ask why. And it feels very fluid and it's over and done with in a couple seconds. But the deep value questions sort of those bubble up for me more. It's almost like I have to put some effort into that.
Okay.
And it comes into, I mentioned earlier the little meditation exercise while scribble down in a journal. And sometimes bigger I've sometimes heard of values as described in like a jar of rocks and pebbles and sand, and it's just like, there's some mega values in there, and there's some, so forth, the spectrum. And some of the big rocks I just don't see all the time, and they're a little bit hidden between in my day-to-day, turbulence of life. And when I look back, this is the time machine's coming back. When I reflect on, a past month or week or the opposite, try to project out a few months, then I'm really thinking a little harder and more closely about values and the relationship between values and my behavior. So I think all I'm saying to summarize is that I also feel like my value evaluation is running all the time, but there's these deeper modes that are less frequent.
Okay. Cool. Well, I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that. I could talk about it for a long time. Let me just add one detail to the meta attention side of this value discrimination we might do throughout the day is that dopamine, we've talked about with the phones and the scrolling and all that, Guthrie did point out is a salience um, neurotransmitter. It's not so much reward as salience. And so I think we're getting we can again get our hands on the levers of dopamine control by exercising that meta attention, that executive function, because it always is a question of salience. Now, that's just again an armchair hypothesis. I'm no neuroscientist, but reading Sapolsky's work and others on how dopamine works with salience determination. I think that high level of mindfulness or meta attention could be something we can pull levers with. So worth paying attention to.
Hmm.
Yeah, I guess I don't know. I don't know exactly where I fall on that. It's like, I don't know. I think yeah, I guess going through this process, I've definitely reflected a lot on like what I value and stuff like that. But at the same time, I guess what I would say is that for me, it seems like a lot of that process is like almost unconscious, if that makes sense. Like it's not like, it's not like if I'm like, maybe it would be better if I was like, it's not like a thinking process and more of like I don't know, because I think sometimes when, if you're just constantly kind of like going through your day and thinking about how everything you're doing is aligning with your values, I don't know, to me it sounds like a little bit exhausting rather than something that just comes as like a felt, I guess, bodily sense of like, I feel like most of the time like we kind of are just operating on intuition rather than like, like cerebral kind of thought out about like, oh, I'm going to do this because that aligns with my values and like I'm not going to do that or something. Like it's not as like, and I guess that's maybe the process. Maybe that's kind of like maybe that's what you're saying with like meditation and neuroplasticity of like it's um like I guess the idea with meditation is that you're doing it, you're paying attention to like you're using meta awareness in kind of this vacuum where there's not a lot of other stuff to kind of pull you away from it. And so then you're kind of strengthening that value, like I mean strengthening that muscle, like reinforcing that circuitry. And then when you're kind of going out in your life, you can kind of I don't know, maybe it just kind of happens without you really having control over it, if that makes sense. I guess that's all I wanted to
Hmm.
add was that for me, it mostly has been like it's been unconscious. I feel like more of like yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
I think that practice of meta awareness, this is kind of what I was saying before, is really for me showed me the unknown unknowns. I assumed they were foundational, baked into the walls, right? I didn't even know that they were there. For me, like the day-to-day busyness, it's not that hard to sometimes my intuition will highlight the more surface level pebbles, right? I think the stones Jesse was talking about, the various sizes of stones and rocks. But some of those foundational things for me personally have been so hard to uncover without having that meta awareness, being able to trace it back. And I can kind of dig deeper, with that practice on my own and understand how they got there.
Cool.
Really well said. Last call for anything we missed in this podcast. I know we have a lot tabled for the future, which is awesome. All right. Well, this is a good place to adjourn. This is awesome. I will be reflecting on this probably for the rest of the day, as long as nothing gets in the way. But even if it does, I'll be reflecting on it later.
Nice.
Great meeting and talking with you all. I'll download this and post it and share it. Not that anybody needs that because I took plenty of notes and everything, but just so we all have it, I'll send this out.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you,
All
gentlemen.
right, cool.
Yeah, thank you so
Talk
much.
soon. See you guys.
Cool.
Have a great
Thank you,
weekend.
guys.
Take care, everybody.
See you.